It is often said that Allah tests those He loves, not to break them, but to reveal to them a strength they did not know they carried. Hardship, in the end, is rarely a punishment. More often, it is the quiet beginning of a story no one saw coming. This is the story of a girl who had no shop, no capital, and no one standing behind her, only a needle, a few coins saved one at a time, and a heart that refused to grow bitter. It is the story of how patience and honest effort built something that no one ever handed her. In a modest neighborhood of Karachi, where narrow lanes wound between old apartment buildings and the azan drifted over the rooftops 5 times a day, there lived a tailor named Naeem. He ran a small shop, barely the size of a room, stitching clothes for the families of the area. Allah had blessed him with a kind wife and 2 daughters, Nimra and Sana. Life in their small home was not wealthy, but it was warm, the kind of warmth that does not need money to exist. Then, illness took Naeem's wife from this world. Friends and relatives urged him to remarry, if only so the girls would have a mother again. He did. From this second marriage came a 3rd daughter, whom he named Amal, a word that means hope. But Qadar, the decree of Allah, had written a different page. While Amal was still a small child, her mother too passed away. Naeem was a man who had now buried 2 wives. Yet he did not let grief consume him entirely. For the sake of his 3 daughters, he returned each morning to his sewing machine, working long hours by lamplight, when the shop's old bulb began to flicker. Neighbors helped where they could, the way close-knit neighborhoods often do. Years passed the way they always do, paying no attention to anyone's wishes. Nimra and Sana grew into young women of 18 and 19. Amal, the youngest, was a quiet, watchful girl of 14. But years of overwork and an unhealed heart had worn Naeem down. A heart attack took him one evening at his shop, and he too departed this world, leaving his daughters in the care of Allah and whatever mercy the world still held. With their father gone, Nimra and Sana, now the eldest, took charge of the small household. A few days after the funeral, Amal sat near her father's old sewing machine, running her fingers over the fabric he had left half-stitched, when Nimra's voice cut through the quiet. Amal, we can't live on the neighbor's charity forever. You've watched Abu work this machine your whole life. Sit down. From today, you do the embroidery and stitching. We'll take it to the boutique and sell it. Amal said nothing. She had learned early that arguing rarely changed anything in that house. She simply nodded and sat down at the machine. And so, her days fell into a pattern. She woke before Fajr, prayed, swept the floor, made breakfast, and then sat at the sewing machine until her fingers cramped. She had learned embroidery by watching her father's hands, and without anyone noticing, her skill had quietly grown finer than his ever was. When a finished piece was ready, Nimra and Sana carried it to a boutique on the main road. They always returned with the same story. The boutique owner said there was a flaw in the stitching. He barely agreed to pay anything for it. Amal listened, lowered her eyes, and assumed the fault was her own. So she worked harder, choosing thread colors more carefully, finishing every seam with more care than the last. Seasons passed this way, one after another. One season, dengue fever swept through the neighborhood, and both Nimra and Sana fell ill within days of each other. Amal nursed them through the night without rest, boiling water, preparing soup, sitting up when their fever spiked. By morning, when the fever had eased a little, Sana spoke weakly. The order is ready. It has to reach the boutique today, or we'll lose the customer. Nimra turned to Amal. Can you take it? Something lifted in Amal's chest, a feeling almost unfamiliar to her. She had never once walked to the main market alone. Still, she answered calmly. Yes, I'll go. Sana handed her the wrapped parcel and gave strict instructions. Whatever price he offers, take it. Then come straight home. There is too much waiting for you. Amal tucked the parcel under her arm and for the first time in her life walked out of the house on her own. The market was a different world, entirely rickshaws, honking, shopkeepers, calling out prices, fabric in every color hanging from the stalls. Amal walked slowly, taking it all in. When she reached the boutique, The owner unwrapped the parcel, and his eyebrows rose immediately. This embroidery, who made this? Before she could answer, a tailor from the neighboring shop leaned over to look. Whatever he's offering, I'll pay more. Sell it to me instead. Amal stood still, confused. Her sisters had always told her the boutique owner found fault with her work. Yet, here were two shop owners nearly arguing over who would buy it. Turning, the fabric in the light, admiring the tightness of the stitches. It was in that market, among strangers, that Amal finally understood. There had never been anything wrong with her work. It was, in fact, some of the finest embroidery either shopkeeper had seen that month. Her sisters had simply been keeping the real price for themselves. She felt no anger rise in her, and no tears either. She sold the piece to the shop owner who offered the fairest price, thanked him, and quietly held on to what she now knew. With the money in hand, she bought medicine from the pharmacy and food for the house. When every need was covered, she found a little money still left in her hand, more than she had ever held before. On her way home, she passed a small mobile phone shop, its window lined with second-hand phones. She lingered for a moment, then walked on. It was still beyond what she could spare. A little further down the lane, she noticed an elderly woman seated outside a small tailoring shop. Surrounded by spools of thread and folded fabric, the woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Come closer, Beatty. You're the one who stitched that piece they were all arguing over at Karim's boutique, aren't you?" Word travels fast on this road. This was Khala Rashida, a widow who had run a small alteration shop on that street for 30 years. She studied Amal's hands, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "Hands like yours shouldn't be wasted doing someone else's accounting. Come back when you can. I'll teach you a few things the boutiques don't tell their workers." Amal thanked her, and before going home, bought a small box of mixed thread spools from Khala Rashida's shop. Old stock sold cheaply, but rich in color. She did not bring home a new phone that day, but she brought home that box of thread, and something told her it mattered more. That night, lying on her mat, Amal's thoughts kept returning to the market, to the shopkeepers arguing over her work, to Khala Rashida's words. "If I had even a little money of my own," she thought, "not money my sisters carry away and decide the value of, but something I earn and keep for myself." She looked at the box of thread in the corner of the room. A small, persistent idea took root. The next morning, before her sisters woke, she began mixing colors from Khala Rashida's thread into her usual work, careful, deliberate combinations she had never dared try before, since new thread had always been considered a waste of money by her sisters. The result was unmistakable. The colors held a richness in the light that her earlier work hadn't had. It was as though sincerity, patience, and a little daring had combined into something with its own quiet barakah, a blessing that grows when effort is honest, even when no one is watching. She said nothing of this to her sisters. She simply kept stitching with the new thread, and the pieces coming off her machine began to shine in a way even she hadn't expected. Phew. Days later, when Nimra and Sana returned from the boutique, they came back surprised. "Karim Bai offered double for this batch," Sana said, suspicion creeping into her voice. "What did you do differently?" "I just worked harder," Amal said quietly. In its own way, it was the truth. From that day on, Amal began thinking not just as an embroiderer, but as someone running a small enterprise of her own. She started quietly setting aside a portion of the money she earned on the side, small jobs. Khala Rashida passed her way. Simple alteration work her sisters never knew about. With those savings, she bought a second-hand smartphone from the shop she had once only looked at through the glass. Khala Rashida taught her to take clear photographs of her finished pieces in good light, and showed her how to open a simple page for her work, a small online shop under the name Resham Designs. Resham, meaning silk thread. Amal posted pictures, quietly in the evenings, after her sisters had gone to sleep, replying to the occasional message from a stranger interested in custom embroidery. She began to notice patterns the way a businesswoman notices patterns, which colors sold faster before EID, which designs brides' families asked for again and again, which days people were most likely to place an order online. She kept this knowledge to herself, the way she kept most things, letting her hands keep working while her mind kept calculating. In time, without her sisters realizing how it had happened, it was Amal's eye for color and her sense of what customers wanted that had quietly become the real reason their household income had improved even while she remained. In her sister's eyes, simply, the girl who does the stitching. She wanted more than anything now to one day stand in a market not with a parcel sent by someone else, but as a woman with her own small shop, her own prices, and no one above her deciding what her work was worth. That night, she made a quiet dua before sleep. For a stall of her own one day, for clients who knew her by name, for a life where the work of her own hands returned its reward to her own hands. A few weeks later, news spread through the neighborhood and across local social media groups. A well-known businesswoman named Begum Nasim, owner of a respected clothing label, was organizing a Hunarman Bazaar, a skills exhibition, open to young women across the city who wanted to display their handmade work. A few promising stallholders, it was said, would be offered mentorship and a place selling under her label. Nimra and Sana were thrilled. "This is exactly the kind of place to make connections," Nimra said, already planning what jewelry to wear. "We should go and see what other boutiques are doing. Maybe we'll learn something useful." To Amal, they left a stack of unfinished alterations. "Stay home and finish these," Sana instructed. "We'll be back by evening." Amal, as always, said nothing. Once her sisters had gone, Amal finished her chores quickly. Then she opened the small cloth bag where she had, over many months, quietly kept what was rightfully hers, her savings, a few of her finest finished pieces set aside under the excuse of extra fabric, and the phone she had bought with her own money. She dressed simply but neatly, wrapped a plain dupatta over her head, and walked to Kala Rashida's shop, who had already arranged a small shared table for her at the exhibition hall through an old friend who helped organize such events. The hall was filled with young women showing embroidery, handmade jewelry, baked goods, and stitched garments. Amal set out her best pieces on a small corner of the shared table, along with simple printed tags reading, "Resham Designs," and her phone number stitched discreetly into the corner of each tag. Begum Nasim moved slowly through the hall, examining each stall with a practiced eye. When she reached Amal's small corner, she stopped. She lifted one piece, turned it toward the light, and studied the stitching for a long moment. "Who made this?" she asked one of the volunteers. Amal answered quietly, "I did, Begum Sahiba." Begum Nasim studied her, a girl in plain clothes, with no fancy stall, no flashy signboard. "This work belongs in a much bigger market than this hall. Beatty, leave me your number. I want to talk to you properly, away from all this noise." She took one of Amal's tags and slipped it into her bag. Meanwhile, across the hall, Nimra happened to glance toward the small crowd, gathering near a corner stall, and froze. "Sana isn't that? No, it can't be." Sana followed her gaze, but the crowd had already shifted, and by the time they made their way over, Amal had quietly stepped back and slipped out through a side door, unwilling to be found out before she understood what had just happened. A few days later, the home phone rang. Nimra answered it. On the other end was an assistant from Begum Nasim's office, asking to speak with the designer behind Resham Designs. Something flickered in Nimra's eyes. Without missing a beat, she answered smoothly, "Yes, this is Resham Designs. My sister and I run it together." She agreed to a meeting at Begum Nasim's office the following week, then hung up and turned to Sana with a triumphant smile. "Whatever this opportunity is, it's too good to let Amal take it alone. We built this household together. It's only fair we go." Amal, returning from the market that afternoon, noticed her phone missing from where she had hidden it and overheard just enough of her sister's conversation to understand what had happened. She said nothing, but that night she quietly gathered every piece of proof. She had photographs of her work in progress saved on an old memory card, a small notebook where she had recorded every order and customer message by hand, and a half-finished piece she had been working on for days, its pattern unlike anything her sisters had ever attempted. At Begum Nazim's office, the following week, Nimra and Sana arrived dressed carefully, ready to present themselves as the women behind Resham Designs. Begum Nasim greeted them politely, then asked a simple question. "Tell me about this stitch here," she said, pointing to a detail on one of the displayed pieces. "It's unusual. I haven't seen it used quite this way before. Nimra hesitated. Sana glanced at her sister, hoping for an answer that didn't come. At that exact moment, Amal arrived at the office, having walked there directly from the market with Kala Rashida beside her for support. She had come not to make a scene, but simply to set the record straight, the way she had always quietly set things straight through proof, not accusation. "Begum Sahiba," she said, "may I show you instead of explaining it?" She sat down, took a needle and thread from her bag, and began to work the very stitch in question, her hands moving with the same unhurried confidence they always had. Begum Nazim watched closely, then looked between. Amal's hands and the piece on the table, the same pattern, the same precision, undeniable. "This is your work," Begum Nasim said quietly. It was not a question. Nimra and Sana said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Begum Nasim's disappointment was clear, but it was Amal who spoke first. "Begum Sahiba, please, I don't want trouble for my sisters. They raised me in their own way after our father passed. I only want what is mine to be known as mine, and I'd like the chance you offered to still stand, if you'll still have me." Begum Nasim studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sincerity like this is rarer than good stitching. "Baiti, and you have both," she turned to Nimra and Sana. "I won't make this public, but Risham Designs belongs to the one who built it. That isn't a small thing to take credit for falsely." The sisters left quietly that day, embarrassed but unharmed, with no punishment beyond the truth itself standing plainly in the room. In the months that followed, Amal partnered with Begum Nasim's label to launch a small embroidery line under her own name. She did not move into a grand house or forget the sewing machine her father had left behind. She kept it in the corner of her first proper workshop, a small rented room above Kala Rashida's shop, as a reminder of where her work had actually begun. Over the years, Risham Designs grew from a single corner table into a small workshop, employing other women from the neighborhood widows and girls who, like Amal once had, knew exactly what it felt like to have their work undervalued by someone else. She paid them fairly, on time, and trained them herself, the same patient way Kala Rashida had once trained her. As for Nimra and Sana, time and humility did what arguments never could. They returned eventually with quiet apologies, and Amal, true to the heart she had always carried, gave them honest work in her growing workshop, asking nothing more from them than fairness going forward. She never forgot what it felt like to be told her work was flawed when it was, in truth, some of the finest stitching in the market, so she made certain no woman under her care would ever be cheated of the true value of her labor again. There is a quiet lesson held in Amal's story, one worth carrying with us. Hard work, patience, and an honest heart are never wasted, even when no one around us seems to notice them. Amal had no capital, no connections, and no one to speak for her at the start. What she had was skill, sabr, and the steady belief that sincere effort, paired with trust in Allah, is never truly lost. She did not seek revenge against her sisters. She did not let bitterness shape her success. She simply kept working, kept learning, and trusted that ease often follows hardship for those who remain patient through it. If you feel today that your effort goes unseen, remember Amal once felt the very same way. Her time came, in its own season. So, Allah willing, will yours. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more.